Hi, in this video I'm going to discuss Chapter 1 of Kant's Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals. So this is part 2 of the series on Kant that I've started. Um, so in Chapter 1, Kant develops his theory of the goodwill, which is central to his what is called Deontological Ethics, which essentially means an ethics centered around developing a strong disposition, a strong temperament, as opposed to an action-oriented ethics. Um, and at the end of the chapter, he develops his notion of the categorical imperative for the first time. So I want to look through the chapter and examine the central arguments that Kant makes. So at the beginning, he begins by introducing the notion of goodwill. So I'll read a little bit from the text. Kant says, "It is impossible to conceive anything at all in the world, or even out of it, which can be taken as good without qualification except a good will. Intelligence, wit, judgment, and any other talents of the mind we may care to name, or courage, resolution, or constancy of purpose, as qualities of temperament, are without doubt good and desirable in many respects, but they can also be extremely bad and hurtful when the will is not good, which has to make use of these gifts of nature, and which, for this reason, has the term character applied to its peculiar quality. It is exactly the same with gifts of fortune, power, wealth, honor, even health, and that complete well-being and contentment with one's state, which goes by the name of happiness, produce boldness, and as a consequence, often over-boldness as well, unless a goodwill is present by which their influence on the mind, and so the whole principle of action, may be corrected and adjusted to universal ends. Not to mention that a rational and impartial spectator can never feel approval in contemplating the uninterrupted prosperity of a being graced by no touch of a pure and good will, and that consequently a good will seems to constitute the indispensable condition of our very worthiness to be happy." So what Kant has done here is he's made an argument that is essentially a criticism of Aristotelian ethics. So he's listed here a number of what are known as virtues. So he calls courage, resolution, constancy of purpose, good health, and also power, wealth, and honor. He claims, so these are all virtues, and Aristotle's ethics was centered around defining what these virtues are and how one may attain them in order to live a virtuous life. And what Kant says is that while these things are certainly desirable, right, it's certainly desirable to have an honest person, a courageous person, someone who has a constancy of purpose, good health, things like this. Of course, these are desirable qualities. Kant's not disputing that. But he says what's even more important is the cultivation of a good will. And what he's going to argue is if that one is lacking such a goodwill, essentially a good intention, is really what he's talking about here. All of these virtues could themselves become vices and be used to commit evil or engage in questionable behavior, things that are not beneficial to society and don't result in anything progressive or positive, right? So it may very well be the case that one is indeed honest, but that actually the honesty masks a kind of deeper dishonesty, that one's public honesty is just a way to more or less maybe deceive people into gaining people's trust, that one isn't essentially lying, but that one is being sincere, but that the sincerity is a kind of mask designed to conceal maybe sinister motives. The same may go for we often see this in the political space, where you may have some political figure who kind of masquerades as caring about people or taking into account the well-being of people, but really only does this on some level, may engage in certain actions that could contribute to this, but really with the actual goal in mind of achieving power and misleading the people. So Kant's point here is that virtues in themselves are not good. They could be good or they could be bad. And of course, they're beneficial often, but what is most crucial is the cultivation of a goodwill, by which, as I said, he's going to mean essentially the right intentions. And that's going to occupy a very central place in Kant's ethics, that what makes one ethical is acting in accordance with duty, acting in accordance with principles, having certain intentions that enable to utilize one's virtues for the sake of good. So that one's virtues are essentially kind of like instrumental to the carrying out of actions that are. That's my. Okay, I'm going to now go to the second paragraph. I got distracted here by something, but I go continue. Kant says some qualities are very helpful to this goodwill itself and can make its task very much easier. They have nonetheless no inner unconditioned worth, but rather presuppose a goodwill which sets a limit to the esteem in which they are rightly held and does not permit us to regard them as absolutely good. Here again, Kant says these virtues are not absolutely good. So he lists them. Moderation in affections and passions. Moderation might be a good, helpful act, but if the moderation is simply done to create the image of someone who is moderate and calm, a lot of cult leaders are very moderate, actually. You can find many of them that try to create this image of themselves as being moderate and level-headed. Mindful is often the kind of term they like to use, but in actual practice are engaged in a harmful kind of cultish activity. Self-control, sober reflection are not only good in many respects, they may even seem to constitute part of the inner worth of a person. Someone might have these qualities and very much identify with them and attach themselves to them in such a way that these kind of qualities begin to define them, but as Kant can say, without the goodwill, they're kind of useless. Yet they are far from being properly described as good without qualification. However unconditionally they have been commended by the ancients. The ancients he's talking here about Aristotle and some of the Aristotelians. For without the principles of a goodwill may become exceedingly bad, and the very coolness of a scoundrel makes him not merely more dangerous, but also immediately more abominable in our eyes than we should have taken him to be without. So maybe if you're reading this, try to think of, can you think of individuals or groups of people that have portrayed themselves in some virtuous or self-righteous way, but in actuality are not such great people and haven't been so great for society? And take some time to think about that, and maybe try to develop it, because I think it will help you to think further about Kant's argument here. Okay, I'm going to read more. A goodwill is not good because of what its affects or accomplishes, because of its fitness for attaining some proposed end. It is good through its willing alone, that is, good in itself. So what Kant's here saying, this is a very important paragraph or sentence, is that the goodwill that one cultivates isn't concerned with goals. It's not concerned with action. When one cultivates a goodwill, one cultivates a certain kind of good disposition, so that when one does act, one's acts will correspond to that goodwill and result in positive change in the world. And he's essentially referring here to a kind of very principled person. Such people often are not necessarily the most passionate or charismatic either. kind of person Kant's describing here may be a very kind of quiet person, but someone who nonetheless uh, has a kind of deep kind of conviction. They could be very charismatic. I'm not saying they couldn't. Kant says, considered in itself, it is to be esteemed beyond comparison as far higher than anything it could ever bring about, merely in order to favor some inclination, or if you like, the sum total of inclinations. Even if by some special disfavor of destiny, this will is entirely lacking in power to carry out its intentions, if by its utmost effort it still accomplishes nothing, and only goodwill is left, even then it would still shine like a jewel for its own sake as something which has its full value in itself. Its usefulness or fruitlessness can neither add to nor subtract from this value. Its usefulness would be merely, as it were, the setting which enables us to handle it better in our ordinary dealings, or to attract the attention of those not yet sufficiently expert, but not to commend it to experts or to determine its value. Now, I think this is absolutely brilliant what Kant has done here. What he says here is that the goodwill that he's talking about here might in some ways be totally useless in the immediate sense. One may have a very strong kind of moral feeling, a strong sense of justice, of righteousness, a set of principles that in the immediate situation don't necessarily result in anything. Indeed, these kind of people are not pragmatic in any sense. The kind of person Kant is referring to here is the type of person who often will be denounced as idealistic, utopian. They might have a very kind of strong belief about the kind of change they want to see in the world. And to those around them, they might seem crazy and out of their minds. But because they have this kind of principled conviction, I guess conviction as I think a kind of corollary to the concept of the goodwill, the long-term results of their goodwill might be far more beneficial than any kind of immediate actions they could engage in. And so that's what Kant's saying, that actually there's something to be valued in a person with goodwill, a person with a kind of strong principled conviction, that such a person is valuable in themselves. I want to give an example that's particularly relevant to me. I've written a lot about politics, particularly revolutionary politics, and social movements. And what one often finds in a lot of social movements is a certain kind of tendency that sometimes gets called movementism. What movementism is it's a kind of subordination of all of one's energy to the immediate needs of a mass movement, with a kind of single issue focus. So someone who adheres to a movementist politics is the kind of person who can be found at every demonstration and every rally, and they want to have a kind of quick and easy answer to every kind of question. So, for example, in the climate movement, the movement to combat climate change, a movementist person would be the kind of person that attends every climate rally, and they like to give speeches, and they may have a sense of the kind of conviction Kant is talking about, but they don't see things in any kind of long-term perspective, and they're very narrowly focused just on combating climate change. And putting forth immediate proposals, as opposed to developing a much more broader outlook that maybe connects the kind of movement to combat climate change to other movements, such as movements that are standing up against capitalist exploitation and connecting the capitalist exploitation to the exploitation of nature and its destructive effects on the environment. And trying to develop a more deeper theoretical understanding of the situation that draws a series of mediating links that can allow for a greater understanding of the social situation. And what that requires is something that isn't this kind of movementist orientation that Kant is in some ways kind of criticizing here. it requires political education, and particularly, it requires a theoretical intervention. It requires the conscious intervention of a group of people or of individuals who can step in and actually broaden the consciousness of the masses in order to step back from the movements and try to critically think about the kind of broader kind of perspective. Okay, now in some ways you might say, well, how on earth is Kant saying that? What I'm trying to draw out here is not necessarily exactly what Kant is saying, but the implications of his argument is essentially that we shouldn't always put action on the foreground. There's a lot of people that think that the answer to every problem is to immediately jump into the streets and go into action, or to jump into an electoral campaign and try to get the new person elected. That there is a value in taking the time to think about things critically and cultivate also a kind of principled approach to things. And I don't think this is in any sense what some might call idealist, that one is privileging thought over action, or that one is privileging intellectual activity over concrete transformation. Rather, what kind of Kant is saying is that if one takes the time to cultivate this, one's actual actions will be more powerful in the long run. So I think if one might say, what is a Kantian like? A Kantian is someone who is maybe more thoughtful. And if you wanted to put them in the Harry Potter house, I would say a Kantian is a Ravenclaw on some level. They are very thoughtful people that like to take time to think about things. In some ways, you might also say they're Hufflepuffs. They're also kind of boring in some ways because they're principled, committed people who often do take action when the moment demands it. If you look in Harry Potter, the Hufflepuffs are always the people, or in some ways the Kantians. They're the ones who are deeply committed to a set of principles that they're willing to carry out in the kind of Harry Potter world. And some people think they're insane. In the final battle I forgot the name of it, the last film, it was the Hufflepuffs who were at the kind of forefront of the struggle to defeat the bad people. I forget their name. It's been a while since I've seen the films. But so this is what Kant's getting at here. I'm just trying to kind of broaden our understanding of how Kant might help us. And maybe you can take some time to think about how this would be relevant in whatever field you are. I mean, for me, it's politics and social movement, but maybe for you, it's our artistic practice. You can see this too in I think in the art world, which I don't know as much about, but someone who I think this would be the distinction between very kind of commercialized and massified approach to, for example, hip-hop music. That's one of the types of music I particularly like. And a more principled approach where you take into account a variety of factors like production, lyricism, the kind of aesthetic quality, and a strong willingness not to sell out to the large record labels who maybe some desire to be famous, but where fame isn't, put on the, isn't the sole goal. It's often the case that a lot of rappers, a lot of singers, will often just kind of sell out. And unfortunately, this happens not always because of their own will, but because there's tremendous pressure to constantly make new music if you want to be really famous. My personal favorite in the kind of hip-hop world is DJ Screw, who I've always liked since I was young. And what I always found, in some ways, you could say DJ Screw was kind of a Kantian. Because, DJ Screw, although there's legends about him that, he would sell, DJ Screw and the Screwed Up Clique would sell tens of thousands of mixtapes from his car in different places of Houston. There would be huge queues of people waiting to purchase these mixtapes. In some ways, DJ Screw, what makes him interesting is he wasn't interested in commercializing his particular approach to hip-hop, which prioritized production over meaning. I mean, a lot of, what's interesting is a defining feature of the Screwed Up Clique, which included a variety of rappers from Houston, um, such as Paul Wall. Well, he wasn't directly affiliated. Little Kiki, for example. These important, very important rappers who a lot of them actually didn't have necessarily great lyrical abilities. All of them were not necessarily lyricists. Some of them were. There were some really great ones. If you look in the Screwed Up Clique, you'll find that they at times had hundreds of members. One of the things I recently found out was that George Floyd, who was murdered by the police a few years ago, and around which large Black Lives Matter movements developed a year and a half ago now, was at some point a member of the Screwed Up Clique. And one of the interesting features of it was that anyone could become a member of the Screwed Up Clique. Because even if you couldn't necessarily rap, you could still get on the microphone. You could flow a little bit, and then DJ Screw would kind of chop and screw it up for you, and you'd still be able to contribute to the production. In some ways, you could say that their ultimate intention was to produce something, to be creative, to not sell out to big record labels. I mean, for all the talk about making money and it's a frequent reference to making money and getting rich in the songs, their goal was ultimately not that. It was to be creative and to not be bought out by the bigger record labels, and as opposed to other rappers like recently, like Drake, for example. I really liked Drake when he started. I still like Drake. He's an interesting rapper, but he ultimately has gone in this more kind of commercialized direction. You see this too in K-pop. A lot of K-pop. I mean, K-pop's artists get hired by a big music label, and then they the music label like essentially puts them out. So, for example, one big one is SM Entertainment. And so, if you want to start as a K-pop artist, you audition for SM Entertainment, and then SM hires you, and then they kind of promote you, and you are from the beginning commercialized. But there are occasionally still K-pop artists that find unique ways, like Taemin, for example, who's a member of SHINee, right? So adore, I love his music. I think he's a genius. Has been able to nonetheless utilize his position to not sell out and to kind of do his own thing. And he's often had to struggle with SM Entertainment to actually make this happen. But he's extremely popular in Korea and also around the world. But there's other K-pop artists where this is absolutely not the case, and where there's this commercialization drive, where the goal is to sell as much music as possible over the principle. So that's essentially, I'm really going beyond Kant now. I wonder what kind of music Kant would have liked. I mean, in his time, it was probably, classical music of some sort. But the distinction here is between a person who has strong principles and convictions, and they're willing to essentially prioritize that, as opposed to a more utilitarian person who's very pragmatic, goal-oriented, is maybe willing to sacrifice elements of their principles in order to get a good career, get a good job. Kantian is probably someone who, although they might have, a stable job and a good career, they may be willing to accept lower pay cut if that means that they can work in a certain kind of job that allows them to, live out their principles and their beliefs. So that's the distinction Kant's drawing here. I hope these examples are maybe kind of helpful. Maybe you can think of your own examples. Now, okay, I'm going to move along, and hopefully this will we won't go too long. We'll only focus a little bit longer. Yet in this idea of the absolute value of mere will, all useful results left out of account in its assessment, there is something so strange that, in spite of all the agreement it receives even from ordinary reason, there must arise the suspicion that perhaps its secret basis is merely some high-flown fantasticality, and that we may have misunderstood the purpose of nature in attaching reason to our will as its governor. Okay, I want to emphasize, reason is the will as its governor. So Kant here is a rationalist. and he thinks that all decisions must be made in accordance with reason. And so essentially, if you develop a very strong kind of rationalist approach to things, then reason will actually govern your will. And if reason governs your will, then all your actions more or less will be moral and will be good. There, if what's governing you is not reason, Kant thinks you're governed by passions, and he doesn't think this is a good thing if you're governed by passions, because then you won't necessarily act in a way that's rational. That's what Kant's doing. He's drawing a kind of binary distinction between reason and emotion, which personally I don't agree with that distinction. But let's look a little bit further. Kant says, in the natural, okay, this is a bit of a difficult example, but I want to focus on it here. In the natural constitution of an organic being, let us take it as a principle that in it no organ is to be found for any end unless it is also the most appropriate to that end and the best fitted for it. So what he's saying here is that nature is constituted in such a way that every particular instrument or tool that exists in such a way that it's also the best suited to that. Now, Kant was writing long before Darwin developed his theories of evolution, but in some ways he's kind of thinking in that mentality. He's also thinking in terms of the capitalist division of labor, which was developing in his time, which held exactly this view that the division of labor will eventually result in the creation of tools and labor processes that are best suited for the particular forms of labor that they're involved in. So that, for example, a coat maker will become specialized in making coats and will develop tools that are perfected precisely for that kind of end. So that's what he's saying. That's the assumption. I read it again. Let us take it as a principle that in it no organ is to be found for any end unless it is also the most appropriate to that end. And by end he means goal here. Suppose now that for a being possessed of reason and a will, the real purpose of nature were his preservation, his welfare, or in a word, his happiness. So he's saying, all right, let's assume something. Now, he doesn't agree with this, but let's imagine that the purpose of human nature is our preservation, our welfare, and our happiness. That the purpose to which human nature strives is these three things. So that's what he said, oh, let's assume that. Let's imagine that. So now he's going to draw the conclusions. In that case, nature would have hit on a very bad argument by choosing reason in the creature to carry out this purpose. So he says that actually reason is not suited to take into account our preservation, our welfare, and our happiness. That's not the point of reason. Reason isn't going to give us the ability to look after our happiness. When you act rationally, Kant's going to say, in no way entails that you'll be happy. When you act rationally, it may mean that you're not living in a contented state where you're looking after your preservation. He says reason is not suited for that. He said for all the actions he has to perform with this end in view, and the whole rule of his behavior, would have been mapped out for him far more accurately by instinct, and the end in question could have been maintained far more surely by instinct than it ever can have been by reason. So he says that actually the instrument best suited to the attainment of happiness and immediate aims is instinct, is our inner drive to preserve ourselves. And reason is not the case. And he's going to ultimately say that's why happiness is not the goal of ethics. Happiness may be a goal, but it's not the goal of ethics. That if you act in accordance with reason, you may actually act in opposition to instinct. You may do something that isn't immediately pleasant, that doesn't bring you immediate satisfaction. To go back to my earlier example, it may mean that you find yourself in a lesser exciting job, that you don't have the career of your dreams, but that you're acting in a way that's more suited to a kind of rational correspondence between your principles and your will. That's what Kant's saying here. If reason would have been imparted to this favored creature as well, it would have had to serve him only for contemplating the happy disposition of his nature, for admiring it, for enjoying it, and for being grateful to its beneficent cause, not for subjecting his power of appetition to such feeble and defective guidance, or for meddling incompetently with the purposes of nature. In a word, this is very important, nature would have prevented reason from striking out into a practical use and from presuming with its feeble vision to think out for itself a plan for happiness and for the means of its attainment. Nature would have herself taken over the choice not only of ends, but also of means, and would with wise precaution have entrusted both to instinct alone. So, and then he says, in actual fact, we find that the more cultivated reason concerns itself with the aim of enjoying life and happiness, the farther does man get away from true contentment. That's what Kant's saying here, is that he says if nature had taken this, or we were so suited that taking into account, enjoying our lives, living for the moment, being mindful in every situation, the kind of happiness propaganda that's constantly spread in the media, then actual fact, Kant says, will get far further away from true contentment. What Kant is here drawing on is the distinction between the immediate gratification of one's desires, which can be in accordance with a short-term kind of plan over a period of years, but as opposed to a much more long-term, broad outlook that takes a distance from short-term goals, that may even reject those things, to allow one to live in accordance with a more long-term plan. And Kant says, if you're constantly, what Kant here doesn't like is the kind of person that's always, ready to have fun. Kant, I wouldn't say Kant's not opposed to having fun, but if fun is the ultimate goal of one's life, then Kant says ultimately you're not going to truly be content, because one will just essentially live, do a bunch of things, but nothing broader comes out of it. So I think Kant is a kind of, you could say, the kind of philosopher that's, concerned with bigger causes. He's very much a product of the French Revolution, which had swept Europe at the time. The ideology of it. He didn't live in France, but the ideology of the French Revolution was indeed there. And you could say Kant is definitely, in a sense, a revolutionary bourgeois intellectual. Okay, I'm going to read more. This is why there arises in many, and that too in those who have made most trial of the use of reason, if they are only candid enough to admit it, a certain degree of misology, that is, hatred of reason. For when they balance all the advantages they draw, I will not say from thinking out all the arts of ordinary intelligence, but from science, they discover that they have in fact only brought more trouble on their heads than they have gained in the way of happiness. On this account they come to envy rather than to despise the more common run of men, who are closer to the guidance of mere natural instinct, and who do not allow their reason to have much influence on their conduct. So far, we must admit that the judgment of those who seek to moderate, and even to reduce below zero, the conceited glorification of such advantages as reason is supposed to provide in the way of happiness and contentment with life, is in no way soured or ungrateful to the goodness of which this world is governed. These judgments rather have as their hidden ground the idea of another and much more worthy purpose of existence, for which, and not for happiness, reason is quite properly designed, and to which, therefore, as a supreme condition, the private purpose of man must for the most part be subordinated. So Kant's saying that, if the type of person who only lives for happiness, and there's a book that came out recently with Verso called The Happiness Industry. I can't remember the author, but basically what this book argues is that our contemporary neoliberal capitalist society is constantly concerned with providing us for outlets for happiness in order to promote a kind of consumerist ideology, where the goal of every activity is to consume commodities. And you're seeing this in a lot of ways in the decision-making policies of a lot of capitalist governments around the world, who are very concerned with immediately opening all the sites of consumption, even if it means that a lot of people are going to get COVID, even if it means that there isn't yet universal vaccination or high levels of vaccination. The vaccine still has ground to multiply itself, not the vaccine, the virus. And that essentially what's in command of these capitalist governments is precisely the desire to encourage consumerism, because what that does is it increases the profits of the big corporations that sell all the commodities that we consume on a daily basis. And Kant is in some ways criticizing this. He's saying that ultimately what this will result in is not happiness. The total obsession with seeking pleasure and happiness will often result in the opposite of that, in the negation of that, in the resulting of suffering. Because you see it constantly, especially in Europe, you had a lot of for example, in the Netherlands, there was the government there constantly is going back and forth between coronavirus restrictions, and then as soon as the numbers go down, they lift the restrictions. And the ultimate thing that's governing their decision-making is not people's health, not the health of society, but the immediate happiness and consumerism of the people. And the Dutch Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, even said recently that the reason why they opened all the shops and ended the lockdown was so that people could go and go to restaurants and go to cultural events and have happiness, have a happy life, and that COVID is destroying that. As opposed to the Chinese government, which actually, in my opinion, although I'm in no sense enthusiastic with the Chinese state capitalist regime, nonetheless, the Chinese government has a much better response to COVID. They had a much stricter kind of lockdown policies in many of the cities where COVID spread. But they've managed to significantly reduce the COVID outbreaks, and the people there are willing to accept lockdowns. People, they're willingly go get the vaccine. You don't have huge anti-vax, demonstrations and all the rest of it. People there have a belief in science, and the working people of China support the government's policy of zero COVID because this is beneficial to society. Although it may create short-term suffering, it's not fun if you can't do anything, you can't go outside. The long-term result of it is that much more actual things will be possible. And now, this is largely due to the fact that the Chinese government has central economic planning, which enables them to do this. That's really the only reason. They're in no way different than any other capitalist country because profit is still in command of decision-making and things like this. But they actually see that the profits of Chinese companies could be, in the long term, protected by enacting immediate COVID legislation. Now, that is exactly what Kant is kind of getting at here. In another sense, what he's, talking about here, he's going on about, he says here that those who constantly seek, true happiness are going to have more drama in their lives. There's going to be more conflict. Whereas this much more kind of principled acting in accordance with reason will enable people to be more content with themselves. They may not always be happy and thrilled with life, but in some ways they may still be contented, and they may be able to get through a more challenging, difficult situation. This is precisely, I think, what the essence of Kantian ethics is. Okay, now we're going to finish this up here. So Kant says, for since reason is not sufficiently serviceable for guiding the will safely as regards its objects and the satisfaction of all our needs, a purpose for which an implanted natural instinct would have led us much more surely, and since nonetheless reason has been imparted to us as a practical power, that is, as one which is to have influence on the will, its true function must be to produce a will which is good, not as a means to some further end, but in itself. And for this function, reason was absolutely necessary in a world where nature, in distributing her aptitudes, has everywhere else gone to work in a purposive manner. Such a will, need not on this account be the sole and complete good, but it must be the highest good and the condition of all the rest, even of all our demands for happiness. So what Kant here is getting at is that a goodwill is good in itself. It's good in itself because it doesn't depend on anything once it exists. A person who has, in Kant's view, a disposition that's in a guidance with reason won't be shaken by the immediate conjunctural changes to which they find themselves. I want to give a biblical example that you find in the Tanakh, the Jewish Bible. The story of Job. It's a beautiful story. I myself am an atheist. I'm not religious. But I find this an absolutely wonderful story that should be read by every person, right? So many of us at least, will have heard the story. This is a story of a man who essentially loses everything. God's essentially testing him in the story. And what he does is he, takes everything away from Job. He causes Job's land to be destroyed. Job's family dies. He gets very ill. And in the story, constantly the friends of Job kind of come into him and say, but don't you, he's essentially trying to say, but God must be testing you, or are you sure God is really on your side? He's saying all this type of thing. But what's interesting about Job is he has such a strong moral conviction. He has such a strong belief, in his case, a belief in God, but not in any really idealist sense. He simply thinks that he was created in this world to live in accordance with reason. And in his case, reason was created by Hashem, by God. And what's interesting about this is all these conjunctural things to which he's subjected, nonetheless, don't shake his conviction. Job is still nonetheless able to keep his beliefs. And I think this is a really wonderful example of a kind of Kantian type of person. And we could look at someone like Job and we can say, that's a really good person. Because they have this kind of disposition, they often are more caring. They may appear to people as somewhat cold and aloof and maybe even fanatical, but actually, because they have this deep conviction, nothing can sway them. If you want to look at the history of the people's movements, let's look at a figure like Malcolm X. I think Malcolm X was one of the greatest human beings of the 20th century. He was someone that fought for black liberation, and not just black liberation. I mean, his immediate goals when he started was black liberation when he was a member of the Nation of Islam. But when he left the Nation of Islam, he created his own organization. He gained a much broader outlook. Adopted an anti-imperialist mentality. And sided with the people's movements around the world and met with many revolutionary leaders and viewed the working class, the international working class, as the vehicle for social change and thought that it would be beneficial of all humanity to fight for an end of racism and an end of all the oppressive structures. And what's interesting about Malcolm X is he defended this till the very day that he died, even when he knew he was going to die. He was assassinated. There's a lot of debate about how it happened. Some people think members of his former organization did it. Others think that there was some kind of plot to assassinate him by those in power. There was a good Netflix documentary about this. But there's a lot of evidence that Malcolm X knew this. He knew he was going to be killed, and yet he still preached what he believed. There's a story that he went and essentially basically said goodbye to his family because he knew he was going to die, and still he did it, and still he spoke. In many ways, Malcolm X is an example of a truly Kantian individual. Charismatic, yes, but governed by a deep rational conviction. Um, beautiful, beautiful type of individual. Okay, now I want to come to the conclusion here. Reason, which recognizes as its highest practical function the establishment of a goodwill, in attaining this end, is capable only of its own peculiar kind of contentment. Contentment in fulfilling a purpose which in turn is determined by reason alone, even if this fulfillment should often involve interference with the purposes of inclination. Interference with the purposes of inclination. What he's saying here is that you may not get to do the immediate thing you want to do. It may be that because you're committed to something, you have to give up a certain thing. It involves a certain deep sacrifice. If you look at Malcolm X, he had a family, he had a wife, he had kids, but he didn't have a lot of time to devote to that. He essentially sacrificed elements of that in order to commit himself to the people's movements for liberation. You look at this again and again. That's what he's saying. To live in this kind of rationalist way, it means to give up one's immediate inclinations. Okay, so now I want to come to the notion of duty. I think I'm going to end this video here, and I'm going to create a part 2 of chapter 1. So I'm just going to finish reading now the section, which will branch into the next video, which I hope to release soon. We have now to elucidate the concept of a will estimable in itself and good apart from any further end. This concept, which is already present in a sound natural understanding and requires not so much to be taught as merely to be clarified, always holds the highest place in estimating the total worth of our actions and constitutes the condition of all the rest. We will therefore take up the concept of duty, which includes that of a goodwill, exposed, however, to certain subjective limitations and obstacles. These, so far from hiding a goodwill or disguising it, rather bring it out by contrast and make it shine forth more brightly. So in this section, he's going to develop this notion of duty. And duty in Kant's sense, in some sense, has a legal sense. The term in German is used, for example, compulsory military service. It has the same word. That's what it means. Something, and it means essentially an obligation, something you must do. And Kant thinks when you act in accordance with what you must do, you act in accordance with reason. You're governed by rational principles rather than immediate inclinations. Essentially, what you want to do is no longer of any immediate importance. What matters is rather what must be done. And this could be extended to what collectively is necessary for the transformation of society, for the improvement of the arts, of the cultural horizon. It involves a kind of subtraction from all individual inclinations. It's interesting because people often accuse Kant of being individualistic. And I think on some levels this might be the case, but really, if you look at Kant, he's in many ways not that at all. I wouldn't call him collectivist, but I certainly would call him someone who isn't individualistic. Kant definitely takes into account the good of society before he takes into account his individual goods. But what he does say is that one's own individual motivations must accord with a kind of rational set of principles that must be kind of collectively kind of agreed on. Okay, so next video I'm going to elaborate on the notion of duty. I hope this video was helpful.